Dakotas. And it'll be operated for several years. And again, too, the information will be used for the design of a prototype unit. Now, all of the work, of course, isn't being done in these large pilot plants, and I had to throw this picture in because it shows some of the work we're doing out here at Iowa State University. This is a reactor set up in one of our laboratories in the chemical engineering department, which this is a gasifier where we're gasifying coal char. And we are contributing something to this gasification program. Now, converting coal into gas is going to be expensive. First of all, you have a very high investment cost. And secondly, the selling price of the coal gas is going to be high compared to what we are paying for natural gas today. Carl Vondra mentioned that at the present time the wellhead price is about 17 cents per 1,000 cubic feet. Well, you can see that the projected selling price for coal gas is going to be about $1 per 1,000 cubic feet. So it's going to cost 4 or 5 times what natural gas costs. Also, I think you can see from the information presented on the previous slides that the development of the industry is going to be slow. And so coal gasification isn't going to help us solve the immediate energy crisis. However, I think that it is promising, very promising, for the future. I think by 1985 and thereafter, coal gasification will contribute importantly to our energy supply.
Thank you very much, Tom, for a very fine presentation. Your comments are certainly in keeping with the high caliber of the remarks made by your fellow panelists. Well, gentlemen, your initial presentations were just great, and ladies and gentlemen, at the outset, I stated that we were fortunate to have a very learned panel with us tonight to address themselves to the energy crisis with which we're confronted. And as the saying goes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and I think it would be appropriate at this juncture if we'd give our panelists a big hand for a job well done in this initial presentation. Now, before giving you a chance to direct questions to the panel, I'm sure you have had quite a number of questions come to mind during this very informative and interesting presentation. I think it would be appropriate if we took a 10-minute break for coffee and cookies, and you'll find these in the lobby. Before breaking, however, I would like to point out again that we are recording this presentation tonight in lieu of the fact that we have such a distinguished panel with us tonight and that these gentlemen can address themselves with such expertise to this energy crisis which we're dealing with. This program is being taped by WI for possible use by others. And therefore, if you do have some questions that you would like to direct to our panel, and I'm sure you will have a number of them, you'll find a number of tablets available out in the lobby, and if you would jot your questions down on these tablets and bring the sheets with the questions on them up to me so that I can direct them to the panel, it'll facilitate the recording of this presentation and its question and answer period. At this juncture, let's take a 10-minute break for refreshments. Thank you, Jim. Well, ladies and gentlemen, before we took our little break for refreshments, I mentioned we'd like to have you write your questions out and bring them up to me, and then I would in turn direct them to our panelists. Let me hasten to add at this juncture, however, that this is by no means intended to cut you off from making a comment with respect to one of the answers or coming up with a follow-up question. If you do decide to do that, however, we would ask that you come to the front and perhaps stand right over here, and then we'll make a microphone available to you so that we can get your additional comments or your follow-up question on the tape. Okay. Well, Jim, since you just got through with your commercial. We'll give you a question field here right at the outset. With an energy crisis evident, why is Iowa Power allowed to promote the use of electricity, one of the more expensive forms of energy? Would you care to address yourself to that
Right.
question?
That's a darn good question, and I hope whoever wrote that question out, that they ask everybody that same question. The promotion and advertising of energy is really irrational in the face of a fuel shortage. There's basic reasons why utilities do this. You know, they're limited on the rates they can charge and the profit they can make, and the only profit they can really make is based on their capital investment. So if they sell more electricity, they can put in a new power plant, and their total rate will increase. Percentage-wise, it'll be the same, but they're allowed being allowed a percentage of their capital investment. If they have 2 plants instead of 1, they can have a larger income, which makes them grow. Now, in terms of what's happening in the country, it's evident that promotional advertising is being frowned on. And the President's own commission recommends that promotional advertising be stopped. Some states have already passed laws against it, and I think it should be universal.
Dr. Murphy will address the next question to you. Granted, one day, is there a possibility of a fission Manhattan project? If $5 billion can be spent on oil exploration, why not $5 billion for a fission project?
The Atomic Energy Commission has been supporting the development of a, quote, Manhattan project on fission, unquote, on fusion. That was
Yes,
fusion,
that should have been
wasn't it?
fusion,
Yeah,
I
it should have been fusion.
Fission. Fission, okay.
Then
Correction was fission.
I don't understand, I don't quite understand the question. The Manhattan project did have to do with fission.
No, I was asking why, under the circumstance, why it was not fission, which is supposed to be the ultimate in this,
Oh, I think you really mean fusion. See, we have the nuclear energy production now takes place through fission, which was developed under the Manhattan Project initially and by industry since. The next step that we're looking toward, because of certain advantages that it has, is the fusion process. And the Atomic Energy Commission has been supporting fusion studies. This has been going on for a number of years. It has been a rather expensive development. The principal problem there is obtaining a sufficient number of the appropriate materials at a sufficiently high temperature. And in this case, we're talking about temperatures of 300 million degrees centigrade. And this obviously presents some real problems. So money has been going into this. This particular year, the funding has been somewhat reduced on the project in order that the money available to the Atomic Energy Commission could be utilized for the development of an improved fusion, an improved fission-type reactor, the so-called fast breeder. But it has been supported, and I'm sure it will continue to be supported. A great deal of work in this subject is also taking place in Russia and in France.
Okay, the next question is addressed to Dr. Vondra. Before I get into that, however, I'd hasten to remind our panelists that if a question is directed to one of you, and after that answer has been given, if the rest of you like, any of the others of you would like to get in there and make a few comments, and please feel free to do so.
I'd like to comment on the last question.
Oh, well, all right then. We'll start
In
that
connection,
call right now.
in connection with the amount of funds that have been funneled into research and development of energy sources, 85% of our federal budget, energy budget for R&D has gone into the nuclear reactor development program. The next source has been gasification, which hasn't been in anywhere near the comparison it has in nuclear. Unfortunately, those sources of energy that we've just recently become aware as posing some practical answers to the problem, such as solar and geothermal, have had extremely small funding. For example, in solar, there's been less than $2 million per year to divide among over 30 investigators. And I think that this very thing is an example of the locked-in institutional problems that we have in the energy field that I mentioned earlier.
Do you have any additional comments, Glenn? All right. Okay, Carl, we'll get to your question then. According to your illustrations, we have a considerable store of oil and gas reserves yet to be discovered. Is the cost in dollars and environmental damage resulting from intensive search and extraction justifiable? What about spending some of this money to study ways to reduce consumption?
Well, in answer, I think it is justifiable at this point because there are no substitutes at present for the amount that we need in the way of energy. Over 50% of our energy is from fossil fuels. In fact, more like, 75? I don't not know the exact figure, but until 1985, there is no substitute for this energy, and we are faced with spending the money for finding more oil and gas and producing it. There is no substitute for it. It'd be great if we could turn this all over to repairing our environmental damage and taking better care of our environment. But unless we're willing to revert to a primitive life today, I don't see any substitute. I think we're faced with spending it. This money, by the way, is private money, not federal money. That $5.8 billion that's going to be spent this next year is what industry plans to spend. That's private capital. That's not federal. And the $10 billion that they intend to spend for the entire development of this energy resource is private capital. There's no federal money there at all. Now, there's some in the way of tax incentive as far as the depletion allowance is concerned, but I'd say from 1985 on, if we have some alternate sources of energy, such as solar energy or geothermal energy or nuclear energy, that will take the place of petroleum and natural gas, then fine. I don't see any alternative but to spend that kind of money, and in fact to spend more money, because we're needing more and more petroleum, more and more natural gas. Unless we can educate our public to use their energy resources with greater care, we can educate them that they can get by with one car in a family and a small car instead of a large 400 cubic inch engine, something smaller than that. We're faced with these kinds of things. And this isn't just the four of us here or the few of us that are here. This is everyone that's going to have to make these sacrifices. And it's difficult to get people to do this, right?
Do you wish to comment, Jim?
Yeah, I read in the end of that question concerning the environmental cost a little additional in this respect. Petroleum, burning petroleum and fossil fuels at the present time unquestionably creates severe environmental health problems. The half of petroleum goes into transportation, and most of that into the private automobile. Very inefficient. Most of it concentrated in our larger cities, where the pollution load is severe. This has been evidenced by EPA's decision to limit automobile travel in Los Angeles, that famous polluted air basin. I think there'll be more of this in the future. The National Institutes of Health at a recent meeting in Washington was accused by a Canadian of suppressing health data due to air pollution. So I think those things that Carl mentioned, smaller sized automobiles, shorter distances, tax on fuel, will be inevitable. What's important to realize is right now we are not covering the external costs of burning resources. If we were to follow the rules of the economic games that we play, all of the costs of health, as I mentioned earlier, due to fossil fuel, those due to automobile use, anything else that creates external environmental problems of health or aesthetics should be included in the cost and the economy of these resources. So I think it's inevitable, and the key to this is education. I think the public will accept the facts of the case if they are presented in an understandable way. And even though this energy question is extremely intricate and involved and confused to the point where even our present government has trouble unraveling things, if it is unraveled and presented to the public, I think they'll go along with it. It's not too many years ago, I remember it during World War II, of course, when gasoline rationing didn't impose a really too severe crisis on people, and our energy consumption today, well, it's more than doubled since then. And interestingly enough, so has the horsepower hasn't doubled per automobile, but it's increased significantly.
Does anyone else want to comment on that question?
I might
Carl?
comment. One thing we could do is increase the price of gasoline significantly in the way of taxes, or we could, of course, ration it, as you point out, one or the other, to discourage the use of it. In Europe, it's quite more expensive than it is here, and if we continue importing it, it will increase in price, and that will tend to discourage its use, and it would discourage the use of larger automobiles as well. I think it's not so much the natural gas that poses health problems. I think in the gasoline, the various additives that are used and some of the chemicals that are used as catalysts in refining that cause the problem. I think maybe Tom can tell us a little more about that.
Well, of course, whenever you burn any fuel with air at high temperature, you generate some nitrogen oxide, and this is considered to be one of the major pollutants. So even natural gas, which is a clean-burning fuel, generates some nitrogen oxides when it's burned. And of course, nitrogen oxides are generated by the automobile, are generated in the coal-burning power plant. Any of these devices that involve the combustion of a fuel with air at high temperature generate some nitrogen oxides. But of course, some of these devices are worse than others.
I might point out that the danger of two sources of pollutants is evident in the case of automobiles and power plants. The catalytic effect of mixing sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and the hydrocarbons that are unburned from gasoline in the proper energy field, such as ultraviolet, produces some unusual and unusually toxic compounds, such as benzoylpyrene and others, which are known cancer-producing agents. And that's the reason that it's not a simple question to respond to these, coupled with the fact that the particulates nowadays coming out of our fossil fuel plants are very tiny, and they get down deep into the lungs. And on top of these small particles ride these unusually toxic compounds.
I think before we scare the audience, we ought to point out, though, that these problems are greatest in areas like the Los Angeles basin, I don't think the problems that you mentioned are too severe here in central Iowa at the present time.
I'd like to respond to that with quoting a clause from the National Air Act, and that is, there shall be no degradation of the present standards, no matter where they exist. And the reason for that is obvious. Pollutants that might be produced in the future, for example, in eastern Montana, where the air is as pure as possibly it can be, and in Iowa, where it's certainly adequate, move in the westerly direction in air sheds. And they add to the pollution load that lie to the east. So there is that's one obvious reason for it. And
now that you brought up the question of standards, we might point out that no thought has ever been given to the economics of pollution control and the formulation of these standards, or no thought has been given to the scarcity of certain resources or to the energy crisis in formulating these standards that you mentioned. I think this is one of the defects in our system of pollution control standards.
well, I don't know what to say to that. I think that the economies of these standards are questionable in any sphere, and it's probably give and take. I'm thinking in terms of the physical problems and the physiological problems, but producing pollutants in Iowa that are carried away by westerlies may rest easy on us, but it doesn't necessarily rest easy on people in the southeast corridor, for example, that have to take this air pollutant load along with the great load they already produce.
I might point out, as far as air pollution is concerned, that there have been periods of time in the geologic past where air pollution has been much greater than it has been now, or probably will be as a result of man's activities. Certainly there's been more particulate matter in the past than there has been now, but we have some evidence that this has affected the climates. And it could be that what we're doing now will be cannot be reversed, and will affect climates as well, or affect some other aspects that we might be concerned with.
Well, Tom, we have a question that's directed to you. What percentage of the energy in coal is lost when it is converted to gas? Follow-up question, if this loss is substantial, wouldn't it be more economical to develop ways to use the coal directly, particularly in heating?
Gee, I wish I knew the answer to that, because that same question has been asked of me 2 or 3 times recently, and I haven't done my homework to look up the answer to that. The processes that are under development are, or should be, quite economical as far as energy is concerned. They should be like the packing plants that even utilize the squeal of the hog. In some of these, I don't think there will be really any substantial waste, but of course, all of the energy in the coal cannot possibly end up in the gas that's produced. I think there are other, of course, possibilities for converting coal into clean fuels, and these are under development too. For example, there's a process under development for converting coal into a clean burning solid fuel, and this involves extracting the coal with a solvent derived from the coal itself, and it involves separating the organic matter of the coal from the inorganic matter, and most of the sulfur and ash-forming material would be removed from the coal in this process. So I think this is a very promising development. And there are a couple of developments like this in prospect. So I think there are other possibilities for converting coal into clean-burning fuels besides gasification.
Okay, Dr. Murphy, we'll direct a question to you. You stated that our consumption is doubling about every 10 years. You seem to accept this without question, and your discussion of solutions did not include a reduction of per capita energy consumption. Why?
I'm glad that question was asked, because it does bring up the matter of making any kinds of predictions relative to what is going to happen in the future as far as energy is concerned. The 10-year doubling time is a historical fact. That is, we can go back for 40 years at least on electrical energy production, and we find that it holds to this line. Obviously, it cannot continue forever because, as Jim brought out so well in his lily pond illustration, we simply cannot continue on the exponential forever. It's a question of an estimate on the part of individuals and groups who have studied the questions of what length of time this doubling may be expected to occur. There have been discussions of this in the literature recently. Within the last 2 months, the magazine Science has presented some data to indicate that certain people, at least, do not think this will continue much longer. The need for additional energy breaks down into two things, as I mentioned before. One of them is the population increase, and this is a factor which is related to the birth rate, to the death rate, and to immigration rates. The other component of it is the additional utilization by every individual of electricity. And this will continue probably as long as we come up with new ideas for utilizing electricity. Each year on the market there are additional devices which the salesmen are interested in pushing that will consume more electricity. Another factor that comes in here is the industrial utilization of electricity. One of the things that was mentioned in the previous discussion here was the rate at which some of the metals are being expended. Now, we will sooner or later reach a point in which we will have to obtain our supply of metals by reprocessing metals which have already been used. This is going on to a certain extent already. Automobiles, junk automobiles, for example, are being compacted, baled, put back into the furnaces, and the material is utilized again. But in each one of these cycles, there are certain materials lost, certain of the alloying elements that are lost. Sooner or later, we're going to realize that we must proceed with the extraction of some of these materials in order to have a supply for other uses that are coming up. For example, in some of the electronic computer devices, materials are utilized which are in short supply. Well, the extraction of the precious elements from materials which have already been used, in other words, from our waste, is an energy-consuming process that we have not yet explored to any particular extent. But we will reach a place in the near future where we are going to have to expend energy for things of this kind that we are not utilizing energy for now. And that will help to build up the additional energy load. Just as a personal estimate, I think we're safe on looking ahead about 30 years at least on this same exponential curve of energy utilization. But that's only one person's estimate. It is extrapolation, pure and simple. It's a crystal ball, pure and simple.
Can I add a comment?
Yes, Jim.
Jim.
There's two areas here that were covered. One, of course, is the problem of per capita power consumption, electrical power consumption. One of the main reasons, of course, is since 1950, in real dollars, the cost per kilowatt for the average individual has gone down. It's decreased every year until last year. Last year was the first time in its history that it rose, and it was followed by a significantly observable decrease in per capita consumption in the Northeast corridor. In support of this, Glenn's reference to the science articles, and I have them here if you'd like to make a note of them, are reports by two separate groups. One, the Cornell Oak Ridge study group of Chapman, Mount, and another one that studied the Northeast portion of the country, and another one by the Rand Corporation in California. And these were statistical compilations that related three main factors as affecting electrical demand: population, price, and I forget what the other one was. You may have read it, Tom. Well, anyway, the significant thing is that price was clearly the factor which influenced per capita demand. And based on these statistics, this study made near, intermediate, and long-range projections of per capita use under a set of conditions. In which, well, there were 5 conditions in the Cornell Oak Ridge study, and A was where prices would essentially not increase, and the 5th case, which was the most constraining case, where price of electricity would reflect the expected increase in fuel cost. Well, out of this study, it was found that price is very much related to demand. And the long-range future would show that a 5-fold decrease by the year 2000 over that predicted could be expected. Now, this shows a sensitive relationship, and this has been something that many economists have been talking about for some time. In other words, regulating our electrical demand by pricing in the utility sector. And this is an ethical means because at the present time, utility rates are unethical. And there has already been a very significant case made in the city of Detroit where the city planning division went to court with the Detroit utility. Income, we're consuming the least amount of electrical energy and paying the most per unit price for it. And the court substantiated that claim and made Detroit restructure its rates. There are also significant, additional significant court cases now due, one in Wisconsin, which will be decided in the very near future, in which the plaintiffs claim that an inversion of rate structures is essential to meet the energy demand and to meet the ethical requirements. Now, this gets pretty complicated, but basically it amounts to one, charging the price for power that is essential to cover the cost. And one of the things is related to the transmission problem. Another is related to the new power-producing units that are required when demand increases. And as you may know, the power plants that go on stream today are much more costly, and their operating costs, therefore, and amortization costs are higher than some of the older plants. And this affects that increment of additional demand. And that increment of additional demand then should be the one that bears the cost of that new unit. And that's been tested in court. So There is considerable action going on clear across the country in this regard. In Los Angeles, for example, they refuse to allow a power plant to be built because of the additional environmental load it would impose on the airshed. So all of these factors are obviously interrelated.
Is there any reason why we have to have a light on the stage? Do we need all these lights here? Would we louse up the recording if we, to get wall plugs, do we have to have those lights on? You and I can sit in semi-darkness, but aluminum can't be made without electricity.
You know, the new trade building in New York City uses as much electricity as the city of Schenectady because it's lighted at about 5 times what would be the normal requirement.
I might add here that Jim referred to this article of Chapman, Tyrrell, and Mount. And the one thing that it does not appear they took into account was the possible development of additional energy-intensive production processes, such as the production of aluminum.
Yeah.
I think they based their predictions on what exists at the present time and juggling the various parameters that go into that,
Well-
but without allowing for the development of any new, highly energy-utilizing processes. And this is the thing that I think will occur.
Well, I don't,
Okay.
for this reason, that the present metals that consume the largest amount of electricity, of course, are steel and aluminum. And at the present time, the new basic oxygen hearth uses per ingot ton only about 1/3 of the electricity that the old process. And if you look at the aluminum production since 1947, it has decreased to just about half the power requirement per unit of aluminum.
This is still based on the types of processes that are being used now,
Well,
or have been
yeah.
developed recently, rather than these processes of getting materials out of scrap.
Yes, and I think that we've come down now to the point where we have to realize that when we design something, we should design it with this idea in mind. For example, the ease with which these non-renewable resources can be recycled, and B, increasing the average lifetime of whether it be a house, an automobile, or any object that requires resources. In other words, we need to pay close attention to these two considerations.
Could our geologist tell us how much iron ore is left? Is there enough iron ore left to have it be a factor for the next 30, 40, or 50 years? Or are we going to be much more dependent upon aluminum, which uses a tremendous amount of electricity?
I can't give you any figures as far as reserves are concerned, but they're vast. I don't really see any shortage in iron ore for 100 years, but it's all directly related to economics. You know, we've got vast resources right under the state of Iowa, but who's going to sink a shaft to 3,000 feet to get them and pay that cost? That's the problem. And that's why we import some of it, because it's cheaper to import it than it is to develop our own, and there's a greater profit margin that's involved. And as far as iron ore resources are concerned, I'd say we have vast amounts. Just how much, I don't know. But from my reading, I would say that we have adequate supplies for at least 100 years, perhaps double that, maybe longer. But no one knows how much iron ore there is present in the subsurface. You know, based on what is present, we can make some estimates, yes, and I think Mr. O'Toole made some estimates here. Those are probably based on what is known in the surface. But there's as much, probably several times more, in the subsurface we don't know about. Now, we can base that simply on the trends that we can see on the surface and project these in the subsurface and say, well, the situation is right, that iron ore ought to be there.
I think we ought to
So-
clarify one aspect of this problem. There's probably enough in the ocean.
Right.
To get it out is the question. For example, if we went out in the backyard and I walled up a $20 bill and threw it out there for the kids, there wouldn't be any question, they'd be out after it. But if we went out on the golf course and I took 2,000 pennies and winged them around 8 holes, there'd be less enthusiasm. And a lot more energy would be required to recover that $20. And that's what we're facing when we're talking about resources. The concentration. Physicists and economists call it entropy. Those things with high entropy require a lot of energy to recover. Now, we have to plug this into some kind of computer. Instead of sitting here making guesses, we have to come up with data, and we have to build ourselves a model. That's what that should have been the policy of the federal government years ago. There should have been a study group whose main job it was to examine our resources, not just the energy-producing resources, but the energy-consuming resources, and find out what the absolute amounts are. Now, those supplies I quoted you are out of the U.S. Bureau of Mines book. They're published. And, I mean, if we take Department of Interior as the spoken word, why? Otherwise, we fall back on technological myths. If we have faith in technology, you know, that's like worshiping some unfigured deity. We have to consider the practical aspects, I think, right now.
Glenn, we seem to have several questions here for you. Let me touch upon one other question here that's been directed to you. How long does it take from the time a power plant begins on the drafting board until it comes on stream?
This depends upon 2 or 3 factors. One of these factors is whether or not the plant is a conventional plant in the sense that it is similar to one which has been developed before, or whether it embodies many new ideas. If it is a conventional plant, then there are 2 additional factors, and I'm speaking here of the nuclear plants. One of them is the actual amount of time taken for construction, which is ordinarily of the order of 2 to 3 years by the time all components are developed, assembled, and the like. And the other factor, which is the one that has put us in the real squeeze on electrical energy over the last several months, is that of the delay in the permits for the construction and operation of the nuclear plants. The procedure is now such that anyone can make an intervention to hold up the development of a power plant, a nuclear power plant in particular, for a period of a year, perhaps by the time it goes through all of the legal actions involved. As soon as that point is cleared up, one way or the other, someone else can come in and intervene. And this process can go on and on. Our power companies foresaw the possibility of the shortage of power and planned nuclear plants well in advance, 6 and 7 years in advance, so that they would be coming on the line at the time the power was needed. But because of the interventions, these plants have been delayed, and as a result, there have been some real strains on the power production. But the actual amount of time involved in the building of the plant is not very different for a fossil fuel plant or a nuclear plant. Not an appreciable amount of time, because the plants are very similar in almost all respects, except the where the heat is produced. And this is a relatively small part of the plant.
Could I respond to that statistic a little bit?
Yes.
Here's a report here from the Federal Power Commission. Years 1966 to 1970, it analyzes the delays in scheduling on stream of power plants, steam electric plants. And out of the total cause of delays here, it looks like there are about a dozen to 15 for various reasons: construction labor, reduced labor productivity, strikes, equipment failure, late delivery of equipment, inability to obtain certifications, and environmental problems, adverse weather, planned deferments due to design changes, budgeting or financial problems. There's about 124 cases, and 8 of those come under the category of inability to obtain necessary certifications and other regulatory impediments, including environmental problems.
What was the date on that report?
1970 National Power Survey.
There's been a great deal more emphasis on the delay through the inability to obtain licenses since 1970, when the EPA went into effect.
This is primarily due to the National Environmental Policy Act, which requires that all federal actions be examined and environmental constraints and health constraints be elucidated. And I think that's proven its worth, unquestionably.
Carl, we have a question which I'll direct to you. Does it really make sense to talk about energy shortages and inadequate energy supplies in the United States when we use several times as much energy per capita as other developed countries and something like 30 times as much per capita as undeveloped countries? Our questioner says, remember, much of our energy, imported oil and petroleum products, comes from underdeveloped countries.
Well, about 30% comes from underdeveloped countries at present, and that's only something that's that has developed in the last few years. Really, most of our energy has been derived locally, that is within our own country. It hasn't been until our present energy crisis that we've increased to 30%. That was a record, as I have read this past month, 29.9%. And we may increase up to 60%. No, in a way it doesn't. We're using the world's resources for ourselves. It's sort of a selfish approach, I suppose. I can't really justify this kind of use, except that to say that if we all want to maintain the standard of living we have, I suppose we are faced with it. If we can educate the nation as a whole to change their ways, and I say everyone, and perhaps we can reduce our requirements as far as energy and other resources are considered. I can't justify that. I've been, of course, involved in the business of finding the oil and finding sources of energy, mainly in the way of fossil fuels, so I'm simply satisfying the demand. I can't, I suppose I can do my part in helping educate the people of the United States, but I certainly can't control what they do. I think you probably can answer that question better than I can.
No,
You want to jump in, Jim?
there is no justification. That's the answer. Obviously, as civilization advances, these now backward countries are going to be developing their own technology, and their options are going to be more and more to keep what they have. It's already evident in the Arab countries that have formed a coalition to make sure that their oil gets the highest price. Not only that, but they're now requesting that they be allowed to invest the $25 billion they get, or whatever it is, from American oil companies developing their resource to invest in our American companies. And this means continually decreasing balance of payments, putting us in the bind. So this is simply another argument for getting more urgent concern about our energy use.
Well, Jim, we have a question which I'll direct to you now. In light of developments in wood-burning heaters, where one elm tree presently filling our landfill here in Ames could heat an Ames home for a winter, using this existing heater means filling it once or twice per 24 hours. Shouldn't this be given some consideration for at least present conservation of other fuels?
Yeah, it's been surprising what increase there's been in the sale of wood-burning stoves across the country. And people are taking advantage of this. It provides a little physical therapy, too, in the meantime, that we all need, me included. I think that there are other aspects of this question that should be brought out. One, I think of the development of solar energy. Right at the present time, there is a company in Florida that is building solar capturing radiant panels that can supply a very significant amount of heat to individual homes. And the foremost researcher, scientist on solar energy says, and he spoke at Ames not too long ago, that by 1985, it's quite possible, if we have the dedication of money and resources fairly distributed to energy sources, that solar can provide 50% of the heat requirement in the typical temperate zones, which would include Iowa and the Northeast. And the technology is not that far away for limited resources.
I might comment that the petroleum industry has been doing research on utilizing refuse, garbage, other refuge similar to this, and converting to petroleum, and they have a process by which a ton of garbage can be converted into essentially 1 barrel of petroleum. But they don't see it as being economical or satisfying the energy need. I think there are some communities right here in Ames, we're talking about utilizing some of our refuse and as a source of energy, as a source of heat to provide us with power, or steam, and then eventually power. So maybe that's not so ridiculous. We may be utilizing some of that refuse, at least on a local basis within small communities, even larger communities perhaps, along with coal and gas, or along with oil, fuel oil, to provide a source of energy. As far as your solar energy is concerned, there are places in the world that are essentially cloudless. Vast areas which are not occupied by human beings, which could be utilized for the collectors for solar energy, and then that could be, of course, transported elsewhere. There is a great deal of inefficiency in transporting it, obviously, but places like North Africa, the Sahara Desert, you've got vast areas that are cloudless for, well, at least 3/4 of the year could be utilized.
Put that in a little more recent focus. The latest statistics are that, by way of comparison, if one takes the Four Corners area of the Southwest and considers a fossil fuel burning operation that's currently going on down there, a fossil fuel plant has a lifetime of approximately 30 years. In other words, when you put capital investment in it, you've got to get 30 years out of it. The strip mining that will take place during that 30 years will cover approximately the same area that would be required by a solar furnace of the same energy level. And these newer revised estimates are based on improvements just recently reported in the light gathering efficiencies of certain of the new panels that have been developed at Minneapolis Honeywell and down at the University of Arizona.
Tom, we have one last question for you here, and it says, how near is the successful desulfurization of Iowa coal?
Well, this is hard to say. I think most of us have read or heard recently of a contract that will be let sometime in the near future between the Environmental Protection Agency and some private industrial firm for the study of the pollution-free utilization of Iowa coal. Now, our state geologist, Dr. Tuthill, was instrumental in organizing and promoting this contract between the Environmental Protection Agency and the group which will be making this study. Now, this study will involve looking at Iowa coal from the standpoint of cleaning the coal before it's used in conventional coal-burning power plants. It'll also involve the possibility of adding stack gas cleaning equipment to our power plants, so say the coal as is can be burned, and then the stack gases from the power plants would be cleaned by some sort of scrubbing process. So the study will encompass both of these aspects of the utilization of our coal. And hopefully this study will provide us with some insight as to the best approach that we might use in trying to utilize this important resource that we have here in Iowa.
I'm not certain just how important that is. We have 7 billion tons of proven reserves, I understand, that are mineable. And that's in lensatic units that range from 6 inches to 6 feet. And just how economic it's going to be to recover that coal, I'm not certain. It may be that it won't be economic, and it'll be much cheaper to bring coal in from Wyoming in unit trains than it will be to mine it here. Perhaps if we strip mine vast areas here in southern Iowa, and that is normally the depressed area of Iowa, agriculture doesn't do as well there, so perhaps if we're willing to put up with the strip mining, that yes, we'll be able to utilize that coal. It will be economic. But if not, it may not be utilized except on a very small basis, such as state power plants, such as here in Ames, the Iowa State plant.
Well, I think that's a good point. It may never be economically feasible for us to utilize all of our coal.
Well, gentlemen, we do have several additional questions, but the hour is growing late, and to those in the audience who had questions submitted, and if we didn't get to them, we apologize. Our panelists, I'm sure, will be happy to visit with you individually at the conclusion of the meeting. And once again, I think on behalf of everybody here, gentlemen, I'd like to thank each and every one of you for making time in your busy schedules to be with us here tonight for this very interesting and very informative panel discussion. Let's give them all a big hand. Gladys, I'll turn the program back over to you now. Have any concluding remarks?
I'd like to thank all of you again, because I know you have busy schedules, and we really appreciate the fact that you came out and help us become better informed citizens.
Well, I enjoyed your